No one expected the safari marathon to turn into a bloody nightmare. The participants, full of enthusiasm and adrenaline, set off along the dusty trail of an African reserve, unaware that a pack of hungry hyenas lurked in the thickets of acacia trees and tall grass. They had heard legends from local hunters about the night chorus and predatory sounds coming from the dark bush, but wrote it off as fantasy. It was not until the sun began to set and the shadows of the acacia trees stretched across the ground that it became clear that something was going wrong. The wind carried a faint giggle that gradually turned into a guttural shriek. The wheels of the bicycles stuck in the dry dust, and it became harder to breathe. The air seemed viscous, imbued with a premonition of death. In an instant, the silence was replaced by a chilling roar as a pair of eyes, glinting like charcoal, popped out of the darkness. The pack instantly surrounded the tourists, and in that moment they realized this was not just a hunt, but an ancient ritual of nature from which there was no mercy. But no one was prepared for what happened next. Dawn cast its golden glow across the open plains as Mike, Amy, and Carl adjusted their gear at the starting line of the safari marathon. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, interrupted only by the silhouettes of scattered acacia trees. Each breath carried the dry scent of dust and wild grass, heavy with anticipation. The trail twisted through the thorny brush, already warming under the rising sun. Shadows grew shorter, and the ground shimmered slightly from the heat. Wheels kicked up pale clouds behind them as they rode, sweat forming beneath their helmets despite the early hour. The guide had warned them before the start. Hyenas had been spotted nearby during night patrols. Their tracks, their eerie laughter, and even torn remains of smaller prey had been documented. But the runners, riding high on the thrill of the challenge, dismissed the stories as dramatized campfire fodder. They passed the first checkpoint, a shallow stream with water thick and brown from sediment. The bikes rolled through without trouble, splashing droplets onto their legs. A few vultures circled high above, unnoticed by the group as they pressed forward, eager to make good time before the heat became unbearable. Amy, trailing slightly behind, slowed as her eyes caught something unusual near the edge of the trail. Tufts of coarse, grizzled fur were snagged on a low thorn bush. Beside it, paw prints etched deeply into the dust, much too large for a jackal. The tracks veered off into the bush, disappearing into tall grass. She shivered and quickly pushed forward to rejoin the others. By midday, the trio approached a dried-out basin where animals were known to gather. The cracked surface of the earth revealed parched veins that spidered outward from a long-gone watering hole. The sun hung directly overhead, casting no shadows to warn them. Carl hopped off his bike, eager to inspect a shallow depression where a few muddy puddles had collected. As he leaned down with his bottle, a sharp rustle behind the shrubs made him freeze. The air thickened with tension, and the rustling grew louder, closer, more frantic. Without warning, two hyenas burst from the underbrush, their lean bodies covered in dust, their yellowed teeth glinting in the sun. They didn't growl or bark. They simply advanced with a feral hunger in their eyes, limbs moving in jerky, unnatural rhythm. The guide shouted from behind, urging them to run, but the cracked earth betrayed them. As they tried to push off, the tires sank slightly into the brittle ground, refusing to give them traction. Pedals spun helplessly while panic gripped the group. The first two hyenas lunged toward Mike. One clamped its jaws around his leg, dragging him down, while the other tore at his arm. Amy screamed and fell backward, clutching a nearby stick, swinging wildly as she tried to fend off a third hyena that had emerged from the brush, eyes locked on her exposed throat. Mike dropped his bike without hesitation and sprinted toward Amy. Her screams cut through the thick air, and he could see the dust rising around her as she thrashed against the snapping jaws. One hyena lunged just as he reached her, forcing him to kick out blindly. The animal recoiled for a second but quickly returned, snarling with renewed fury. Mike swung his arm, striking the beast with his elbow, but another had already circled behind him. Carl, a few yards away, fumbled through his pack with shaking hands and pulled out the emergency flare. He struck it against the metal casing and a burst of flame hissed into the air. The sudden fire did not frighten the hyenas. Instead, it seemed to stir something deeper. The light reflected in their eyes, and their growls grew louder, more frenzied. The flare became a beacon, drawing them in rather than pushing them away. The cries of the group mixed with the unrelenting laughter of the hyenas. Then came the sounds that made the savannah itself hold its breath. The snapping of tendons, the dry crunch of bone under pressure, the tearing of flesh. The open plain amplified every note, broadcasting the horror far beyond the reach of human help. The echo carried into the bush, as if warning the rest of the wild what had been unleashed. Blood poured down Amy's leg, staining the earth beneath her. She clawed at the dirt, her fingernails filling with dust and pebbles, as she dragged herself toward a fallen log. Her breaths were sharp and shallow. Pain racked her side, but she managed to prop herself up, smearing blood across the wood. For a brief moment, she saw the jeep in the distance through blurred vision. Hope flickered, then vanished at the sound of another growl behind her. Mike was locked in a desperate struggle, the weight of the hyena pressing down on him as he punched and shoved to keep its teeth from his face. His shirt was torn, and blood smeared across his shoulder where claws had slashed through. He twisted his head to the side and saw Carl, still clutching the flare, surrounded. The others had turned their attention to him, their movements coordinated and efficient. It wasn't random, this was a calculated attack, and Carl was their next target. Carl gripped the last remaining flare with his uninjured hand and swung it wide in a desperate arc, hoping the fire would hold the animals back. But before he could strike again, a hyena lunged forward and sank its teeth into his forearm. The impact forced the flare from his grasp, and the flame sputtered as it fell into the dirt. Carl screamed as the creature tore into his flesh, shaking its head violently like it was ripping bark from a tree. Blood sprayed across the cracked soil, darkening it instantly. Mike saw Carl go down and charged forward, throwing himself between the circling hyenas with blind force. He swung his fists and shoved the snarling beasts aside, trying to create a path toward Amy. The animals snapped at his legs, their claws scraping across his skin, but he didn't stop. Dust and blood swirled in the air around him as he yelled, flailing with everything he had. Amy had reached the edge of the jeep's shadow, barely clinging to consciousness. He knew if he didn't get her out now, they'd lose her too. Just as Mike reached the clearing, the bushes behind him rustled with a sudden intensity. From the wall of thorns emerged a massive hyena, larger than the rest, with a thick scar running down its muzzle. It moved slowly, deliberately, with a presence that silenced the chaos for a moment. Its muscles rolled beneath its matted coat as it stepped forward, jaws slightly open, saliva glistening on its teeth. The pack instinctively made room for it, as if surrendering command to their leader. The alpha's gaze passed over the scene like a cold calculation. It didn't growl or lunge like the others, it simply watched, eyes locked onto Mike's shaking form. It studied the positions of the wounded, the distance to the jeep, the weakness in Carl's bleeding limbs. It seemed to understand not just the kill but the meaning of the moment. This wasn't hunger. This was dominance. This was a reminder that they were intruders on ancient ground. The guide, who had kept back in fear, finally snapped out of his paralysis. He raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air, the thunderous report echoing across the plain. But instead of scattering, the hyenas flinched and growled louder, as if the sound only stoked their aggression. Dust lifted in a haze, and the alpha didn't retreat. It took another step forward, eyes never leaving Mike. The battle wasn't over. It had only shifted into something far more terrifying. Amy dragged her body across the cracked earth, each inch gained costing her a wave of agony. Her limbs trembled, slick with blood and sweat, but she kept her eyes fixed on the distant shape of the jeep. It sat in a shimmer of heat, just beyond the edge of the clearing, so close yet unreachable. Her fingernails clawed at the dirt, leaving shallow trails behind her as she pushed forward, choking on the dust kicked up by the chaos. Mike clenched his jaw, his muscles burning with desperation. Carl was still conscious, but barely, as the hyena's powerful jaws held tight to his leg. Blood soaked the ground beneath them, turning the dust to rust-colored mud. With a roar, Mike grabbed a broken branch and swung with all his strength, but the beast didn't flinch. It growled and pulled harder, determined to finish what it had started. Mike didn't stop. He kicked, punched, and screamed into the rising heat, but nothing loosened the hyena's grip. The guide, panic in his eyes, tossed a knife toward Mike. It skidded across the dirt and stopped inches from his outstretched hand. Mike dove for it, ignoring the sting of cuts and the growing weight of exhaustion. As he gripped the handle, the hyenas sensed the shift and began to encircle again. Their shadows moved like liquid through the dust, tightening the noose. Mike's chest heaved as he held the blade out, blood dripping from his fingers. Amy, nearly blind from the haze and her own weakening vision, lifted her arm and waved it desperately toward the Jeep. The windshield was coated in a fine layer of dust, and the driver inside appeared unaware of the horror unfolding only yards away. Her hand dropped, limp with defeat, as her strength gave out. The world tilted, spun, and narrowed to the sound of snarls and the pounding of her heart in her ears. The Alpha stepped forward, his movements deliberate and silent. Each footfall landed with terrifying grace as he approached Mike. His eyes burned with focus, locked onto his prey with a clarity that suggested more than instinct. The pack held still, watching their leader prepare for the final blow. Mike met the gaze, still crouched beside Carl, gripping the knife, his body shaking. The air around them stilled as if nature itself held its breath. The roar of an approaching engine cut through the heavy silence, its mechanical growl rising above the sounds of labored breathing and distant snarls. A second Jeep burst over the crest of a nearby hill, kicking up a plume of dust that hung in the golden light like smoke from a fire. The silhouettes of rangers emerged from the vehicle, rifles raised, eyes wide as they took in the carnage ahead. The air was thick with the scent of blood and the metallic tang of fear. But the rescue came too late. What remained of Mike and Carl was scattered across the cracked ground, torn and broken beyond recognition. The dirt was stained dark beneath them, a chaotic pattern of violence frozen in place. Torn fabric flapped in the wind. Bones jutted from flesh like splintered branches. The rangers hesitated, struck by the brutality of what they had stumbled into, the savagery too overwhelming to process in a single glance. Amy lay crumpled near Mike, her body barely rising and falling with breath. Her face was pale, blood streaked down her neck, and one arm lay limply across her stomach. The alpha hyena stood over her, his coat matted with gore, nostrils flaring as he drew in the scent of her open wounds. He paced in slow circles, his claws scoring the ground with each step, his yellow eyes fixed on her like a predator savoring its triumph. Around him, the remaining hyenas lurked in the haze, waiting. The first shots cracked across the clearing like thunder. The rangers didn't hesitate again. Bullets sliced through the dust, whistling past the scattered bodies as they struck the ground near the encroaching beasts. One ranger fired into the air, another directly at the pack. The hyenas scattered, startled by the sudden violence, retreating in bursts of speed, their yelps echoing into the dry bush. The alpha gave one last stare before vanishing into the brush, disappearing like a shadow swallowed by night. A ranger knelt beside Amy and checked for a pulse. His face darkened. Another retrieved a blanket from the jeep and gently draped it over her lifeless form. No words were spoken. The savanna stretched out around them, painted in the fading crimson light of sunset. The wind stirred the grass, carrying away the final echoes of the hunt. Above, the sky burned orange and red as if the land itself mourned. There, beneath the blood-colored horizon, lay the reminder that in the heart of the wild, mercy was never guaranteed.